Donkey Kong Country, one of Rare's most beloved series. To this day, Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2 are viewed as absolute classics in the platforming genre, and are must-owns for anyone's gaming library. But wait, isn't there 3 of them? What about the third one? While DKC 1 and 2 are often praised for their tight platforming and fantastic soundtracks, Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, often gets brushed aside and ignored by the general public, often being regarded as the weakest in the trilogy. The goal with this video series is to shed light on games that have either been overlooked, poorly received by critics, or divisive amongst the gaming community, and pose an argument as to why these games deserve a second chance in the spotlight. So first up, let's take a deeper look at Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble. One of the biggest criticisms you often see with DKC3 is its soundtrack. This is mainly due to the fact that DKC's previous composer, David Wise, is not the main composer for this entry. Instead, DKC3 has Evelyn Fisher in the lead composer role, with Wise taking on a smaller composing role for the game. People often criticize Fisher's work for being too different from Wise's past work on the games, but I'd argue that this different feel is exactly what DKC3 needed. The Kongs find themselves in a whole new region, and the mood of Fisher's music conveys a sense of mystery and uniqueness that fits perfectly with this new setting. One great example of this is if we compare the water levels from Wise and Fisher. Aquatic ambience gives off a peaceful, relaxing melody, like we are in a calm and familiar area. Waterworld, on the other hand, has a much more haunting melody to it, giving off a much more uneasy feeling. We're in unfamiliar and potentially dangerous territory. These two themes showcase how the differences in each composer's choice in music style reflects how the Kongs feel when they're in somewhere they know, like Kong Island in the first game, somewhere unknown like the Northern Cremisphere in the third game. Also, just listen to Rockface Rumble and tell me it's not an absolute banger. Another criticism I often see with DKC3 is in regards to its level design, specifically its over-reliance on gimmick levels. Gimmick level is typically any level that relies on a type of mechanic that is not ordinarily a standard in progressing through a level. Now, gimmick levels are certainly no stranger to the Donkey Kong Country series, as evidenced by DKC1 and especially DKC2's use of them. But for some reason these types of stages have been received more negatively in the third game, believing they detract from the game's platforming and overall quality of the stages. While yes, there's a lot of these types of stages in DKC3, I don't believe they are a detriment to the design philosophy of the game. Gimmick levels are needed in these types of games to freshen up the player experience. These little curveballs help to keep the player invested by offering more variety to the stages, and oftentimes end up being some of the more memorable moments in the game. And hey, at least none of DKC3's gimmicky levels require an epilepsy warning. Another observation made in regards to the level design of DKC3 is the sheer number of vertical stages it has. Sure, DKC2 had its fair share of vertical platforming stages as well, but nowhere near the amount that DKC3 has. I do have to give the developers credit for experimenting more with verticality in their level designs, as it's something that's not too often seen when it comes to platformers. However, with the exception of a few of these stages, I do feel these vertical based levels are the weaker stages in the game. Oftentimes it can be really hard to see where you were going, more often than not end up taking some unfair hits from enemies that you would have no way of knowing were even there. While many of the vertical stages fall a little flat for me, the game does make up for them with the more solid and traditional horizontal stages. I'd also like to briefly mention two smaller criticisms of the game: the inclusion of Kiddy Kong and the change in art style, specifically in regards to the redesigns of many of the enemies. There's not a whole lot to say about these two critiques, but I figured I'd mention them anyway as they are brought up quite a bit when this game is discussed. Now, first up, Kiddy. Due to the fact that both Donkey and Diddy Kong have been kidnapped, for DKC3 we are left with what people like to call the C-team of Dixie and Kiddy Kong, which I just find offensive. I mean, Dixie is objectively the best character in the series, like, come on. Kiddy, on the other hand, well, nobody likes Kiddy. He's essentially a dopier version of Donkey Kong, playing almost exactly the same as him, except he can do this. And his scream is pretty funny. I don't know, Kiddy's okay. I do think the hate for him is a little overblown, to be honest. As far as the change in art style is concerned, I'd say it's just a matter of preference. Whether you prefer the more realistic look of the first two games or the more cartoony look of the third game, it's entirely up to you. I don't think one is necessarily better or worse than the other, just different. So now let's look at some aspects of DKC3 that make it stand out from its predecessors. One of DKC3's most standout features is its overworld. Generally speaking, an overworld in a video game is meant to convey a sense of progress on a grand scale to the player. The Donkey Kong Country games have always done a good job with showing this sense of progress. In DKC 1 and 2, you're always moving upwards towards your final destination on the overworld. There's a sense of accomplishment when you finally reach the summit of the map that you've been scaling throughout the entire game. Being able to look down and see how far you've come really showcases the feeling that you went on a journey, and not simply went from point A to point B. In DKC3, a similar strategy is utilized, but on a much grander, more creative scale. Instead of a simple, static world map, we have a large, freely explorable continent to navigate through, full of its own secrets to discover. No longer is the overworld a simple tool for the player to move through the game, but instead is now directly integrated into the gameplay itself. There are hidden collectibles, dynamic events that change parts of the map, and even NPCs to talk to and barter with. Not only is the overworld an integral factor in the game, but also how you travel around it. In this game, Funky builds the Kongs a variety of vehicles to use throughout the game. At first, we start with a simple motorboat, slow and incapable of going over these simple rocks, limiting your access to most of the map. As you progress further into the game, however, this boat continues to be upgraded into more and more useful vehicles, slowly opening up the rest of the map to the player. This mechanic adds a whole new layer to player progression, not only allowing the player to move around more freely, but giving a new sense of excitement when defeating each of the bosses and seeing what new vehicles you'll get from the components they drop. Speaking of bosses, DKC3's boss designs, in my opinion, are a huge step up from the previous games, especially the first one. No longer are you simply jumping on their heads an arbitrary number of times, but now they're force-feeding beetles to a giant barrel. Or having a snowball fight with a maniacally laughing snowman. The boss's visual designs have also received a significant upgrade. I find the bosses in DKC3 to be way more interesting to look at compared to the larger version of standard enemy but in a different color some of the past boss fights have been. DKC2 does have some cool fights though. In this game though, we have a cool looking robot named Chaos, that one boss from Super Metroid, whatever the hell this thing is. Alright, DKC3 has some goofy bosses too, but my point still stands that they are unique. And I think that's the best way to describe the game. Unique. Donkey Kong Country 3 offers a fresh take on the DKC formula, with its unique approach to level design and its vast overworld to explore, while still remaining true to the core concepts that make the Donkey Kong Country game so special. Sure, not all the levels are going to land, and some of the visual changes may not be to everyone's liking, but DKC 3 remains a strong closer to the Super Nintendo DKC trilogy. If you're a fan of the first two games and never really got around to playing the third one, try it out. Donkey Kong Country 3 is definitely worth giving a second chance.